can be together again. I'll begin by reading from Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31, I'm going to read verses 12 through 17. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "But as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, You shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed." When I think back on my life and try to think about what a good day was, there's lots of different things that come to mind. There's been lots of very special days in my life that I've experienced really beautiful things, or I've made commitments or seen beauty that really stand out to me. And I think when I think about what makes a good life or a good day, or what have made good days in my life, one thing that resounds, a theme maybe that comes up, is days when I've been able to fellowship all day long, learn about the scriptures all day long, just dwell with my God and with my brothers and sisters. That always makes me feel like I've had a really good day. One time that really stands out to me was on a reading week when I was at school. The whole class that I was in, we went down and we spent the week at the Freed-Hardeman lectures. And it was just good. And every day we would wake up and we would go and we would hear lectures and we would share breakfast. And throughout the whole day we would talk and we would challenge each other and we would grow and we would be close to God. And what a special days those were. And you'd get to the end of the day and you were just exhausted from doing all that thinking and all that listening and all that challenging. But it was good, and it was uplifting, and it was overwhelming. I really appreciate the recognition that I have for that in my life, and the encouragement I try to put in my life to make those days happen more often. Because I think we all know that life gets busy. Life gets overwhelming, commitments are many, and it's easy for us to get caught up in the things of the world and not have those days. And so I'm always grateful for the parts of the days that we can share together as a congregation. And when we get those opportunities to just be near to God all day long. I love this idea of the Sabbath that God gives to his people. This Sabbath command that he gives to them. That you will keep this day set apart. You will keep it free from work. It will be a day for me and you, and what it means, what our relationship means to each other. I hope that we are able to grapple with this principle and understand that it's not a command to us in the same way that it was a command to them, but there is an insight here and a truth that we must pursue if we are to benefit as greatly as we could and from our relationship with God, and bring him the glory that he desires from our lives. Well, we've been looking at these passages here with Moses upon the mountain, speaking with God in this surrounded by the glory of God, all the people waiting below, the covenant confirmed, they've agreed together as a people that we will follow God, and Moses has gone up. And God has been sharing with him all these details about what it will mean for him to live among them, how it will be that his physical presence will find a physical home among the people of Israel. And at the end of his message to Moses, he stops and he begins to tell him about the Sabbath. And there's been a number of teachings about the Sabbath through Exodus, and we'll look really briefly at those. But here maybe we should note especially that in the commands that God has given for the creation of these parts of the tabernacle, he still wants his Sabbath respected. He still cares very deeply, even in the midst of this most holy work, that there should be a day set apart for rest, set apart for a sign to God. So I wanted to look just at a couple of these verses where the Sabbath has come up in the book of Exodus. And there's three, I think, up to this point that have spoken of the Sabbath. In Exodus chapter 16, we see the Lord providing manna for the people. They're in the desert and they have nothing to eat, and so God provides for them through this miraculous food. And so he says, go out every day and pick up what you need, and you can eat it. But he said on the seventh day, don't pick up anything. Instead, on the sixth day, pick up twice as much and save it, and it will be good for you on the seventh day. And that was the only day where you could save it. Every other day would go bad, but from the sixth day to the seventh day, you keep it and you eat it, because on the seventh day you rest. It's a Sabbath to you. And some people struggle with this, and it certainly is a object of faith, because some people, I'd kept some extra and it got worms in it, so you figure, well, I'm going to have nothing to eat tomorrow if I don't go out and collect. But God provides, and he preserves, and he protects this Sabbath rest for his people. Well, in Exodus chapter 20, we have the Ten Commandments, these platitudes of which God gives as he begins to lay out his law. And lo and behold, we read in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but to the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, neither your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Amazing to me. One of the Ten Commandments that become closest to the heart of the law for the people of Israel, that stand above all the rest, is this command to keep the Sabbath holy. And in Exodus chapter 23, we see Sabbath commands given, but with a different spin on them. He's talking here about maybe some social justice kind of things, how you treat each other, how you take care of each other in community. And in the midst of that, he thinks about the Sabbath. So God says in verse 10, you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield, but in the seventh year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. And you are to do the same with your vineyard and with your olive grove. 6 days you are to do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that and the son of your female slave, as well as your stranger, may refresh themselves. The Sabbath was to be a time of rest for all people, even for the animals, that all would find a day of peace and a day of rest. Well, God brings this command of the Sabbath out, I think, most fully in Exodus here in chapter 31. And he begins with this command to keep my Sabbaths. And we recognize that this is a command from God to his people. You shall do it. It's not a negotiable idea. It's not simply a suggestion, but this is a mandatory requirement for being the people of God. You must keep my Sabbath. It's a firm command. There's no doubting. And we'll see that unfold in this passage. But I find it so interesting here. It's not as if the great importance was in the act itself, was just in being inactive. That wasn't the full goal of the Sabbath. Certainly, we can reflect on the different benefits that brought to the people, to have a day in which they could refrain from work. But it was more than simply a day when everyone took off and just relaxed. Its purpose goes far beyond that. God says to Moses that this is a sign This day is a sign. It means something. It reminds me of a kiss. A kiss is nice in and of itself. There's a good feeling there. But a kiss is so much more than my lips touching Kim's lips. And say everyone's lips. A kiss is more than that. There's meaning. There's commitment. There's love. There's passion. There's all these beautiful things that aren't just the act itself, but what it means. And I think the Sabbath is kind of like that. It's not just that it's good for you to take a break from work one day a week, but it's a sign. And what it's a sign of is a beautiful thing between God and his people. And so God says it's a sign between me and you. It's something that you should know about your relationship with God, something that you as a people should recognize about me, and something that me as a God will recognize about you. God is asking them to know and to show that they know something about who he is and what their relationship to him is like. And so the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath then becomes an act of faith. It's something that proclaims, I know something about my God and what he thinks about me and the relationship I have with him. And so Sabbath keeping then becomes very important. It becomes a religious matter to keep the Sabbath because it says something about who God is and what God means to me. And so despite the Sabbath, the value that the Sabbath has in and of itself, its true and deeper value is in the sign to show the truth that God sanctifies his people, that God makes them holy, that God sets them apart, that God has pulled them out of the world, God has pulled them out of Egypt, God has pulled them out of sin to be his people, to be separate, to be different, to be his, to be dedicated to God, to serve them with their whole lives, to be unique in a world that chases after all these different things in a wonderful way. They are God's. They are God's people. They and the lives they live and the nation that they are a part of are especially God's. They're set apart and they're to be his. This is the sign of the Sabbath, that you are God's people. And so, the message is because that I've set you apart and made you a holy people, I've pulled you out, you will set apart and you will make holy one day of the week. That one day, every day is for work, but not this day. It's set apart, it's holy, it's different. And it's an example that just as this day is different, you are different. And so the message is given that not every day is a day of work. Every seventh day was to be a day of rest. And you can imagine the great blessing that this would bring to so many people. A day to stop and to consider and to break the demands of the daily routine and of the work that would come upon you, and to reflect on the special relationship that you as a people share with God. What a blessing that would be. Now, conversely, if your attitude is in a different direction, if you're desiring different things, this could be a great curse. Because you might not prize very highly your relationship with God. Rather, you might prize the work that you can do, the comforts that you can build up for yourself, the wealth that you can accumulate, the trading that you can do. And so if your eyes are not set on God's things, but on your things, and if you need to provide for yourself, then having a day of forced retirement is hard. It's a burden on you. And it's interesting, of course, we look at this command, and it's so normal in our culture to have a day off work that maybe we don't grasp the challenge that it was for them. But we see through Scripture that it is a continual struggle for God's people until they come back from exile to keep this day a Sabbath wholly apart from work for God. Now God lays out the punishment for those who refuse to keep the Sabbath holy, who instead would choose to make it a day of work. And it is a death punishment. It is a punishment that excludes people from any more living among the people of God. And I think there's a reflection in this, in the seriousness with which God gives this command, and the seriousness with which he considers the truth that is the sign behind this day. My people are holy. They're set apart from me. To deny that fact, to pull back that fundamental truth about who Israel is, the people of God, to work on the Sabbath, the day that is set apart, to remind them of that truth, God will not allow. And so if you wanted the people of Israel to be something other than God's something other than holy to God, if you wanted them to be set apart for something else, then God calls to face an answer through the death penalty. And we have, in fact, one recorded incident in Numbers chapter 15 where this death penalty is enforced. And it's an interesting situation. They find a man doing work on the Sabbath, and they bring him in, and they're not really sure what to do. But God voices his opinion. He tells them that this man needs to be put to death. And so we should recognize that for the people of Israel, this is a very serious command. Well, we read twice in this passage that this is not to be something that's only done in the desert or something that's only done for a matter of time. It's to be a continual, from generation to generation, an everlasting part of this covenant that they would hold this Sabbath. For as long as Israel was to be the nation of God, they were to be holy and set apart from him, and they were to respect this sign that he gave them of the Sabbath, to wholly and truly reflect the truth of being set apart. And so just as circumcision was an everlasting sign for the descendants of Abraham that you have this promise, the Sabbath is an everlasting sign that you are set apart and holy and dedicated to God. Well, little is said of the Sabbath once we get out of the books of Moses. We read one instances in the Kings where just in passing and talking about the routines of soldiers and protecting the king, that, the ones who would be called off on the Sabbath should do this job. And we don't get a sense in which the Sabbath is being respected, but there's no judgment made on it. We see in Isaiah that one of the comments that Isaiah makes about the people is that they only use the Sabbath to worship other gods instead of worshiping the true God. Well, after the exile and the return, we see in Nehemiah this situation where the people are inviting in on the Sabbath day merchants, and they're going and they're trading with them. And Nehemiah, when he sees this, is outraged. He can't believe that this is happening. And he says, don't you understand that the exile happened because of things like this, that we refuse to follow the Lord's command? He calls it an evil thing, what they're doing. And it even goes so far as to put in place all kinds of measures. He makes the doors of the city close on the evening before the Sabbath to make sure that none are breaking this command. Well, the Sabbath became a distinctive mark for God's people. It wasn't so much before the exile. We don't read about them keeping it. We don't see other nations coming into conflict. But after the exile, we do. It's interesting to read some of those testimonies we have from the time between the periods. Not the scripture of God, but we learn about the history of the people of Israel. And in the midst of that time, they faced a lot of persecution, especially under Greek rulers. And we see many examples of the attempt to destroy the Jewish religion. And it's interesting that one of the high points of that is around the Sabbath. And it became even a point to which people would die over. A point to which the people would be attacked on the Sabbath and they wouldn't defend themselves because they considered that work. And so by the time we come to the time of Christ, it's so deeply ingrained in the people that we see the reaction that they have with Jesus. Jesus is walking through a cornfield and he picks a stalk of corn and they want to put him to death. And he heals a man on the Sabbath and they call it evil. They've so fallen into the symbolism of this command that they've missed its greater purpose. And so Jesus will have teachings for them about what the Sabbath really means, but they took to heart the idea that this was an everlasting commandment between them and God. And certainly they went too far and they put their own traditions before the Word of God, but they understood that this was important. Well, we read in verse 17 too that it is a sign between my people about creation. The Sabbath was a sign of God's creation. The seventh day was chosen. A 7-day week, 6 days for working and 1 day for resting. And it was not just a random number that God chose. It wasn't because people are really good for working for 6 days and then they need a rest. It was because of creation. Because God, in making the world, created for 6 days and rested on the seventh. What a resounding statement it makes to the world. That we rest on the seventh day because our God, who created the world in 6 days, rested on the seventh day. The God of Israel, our God, who made the whole world, rested, and so do we. Well, we could think for a moment about the passages that we read in the New Testament that have to do with Sabbath keeping. Certainly, we see that it's one of the key controversies in the Gospels between Christ and the religious leaders of the day. Again and again and again, it's a point of controversy that Jesus is doing things that the religious leaders find unacceptable on the Sabbath. And Jesus has answers for those. He explains to them that man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. It was meant to be a blessing. They believed that it was okay to pull your animal out of a pit on the Sabbath, but you couldn't help a dying man. Well, they'd lost sight of what the Sabbath was really about. More than that, Jesus explains to them that he is Lord of the Sabbath. He is over and above the Sabbath. But it is one of the reasons, especially early in Jesus' ministry, that they begin to pursue the death penalty for Jesus. As we go past the Gospels, we see that Paul often in the book of Acts will go and reason with the Jews in the synagogues on the Sabbath. He doesn't say he does that because the Sabbath is important for that, but I think more he's taking advantage of this opportunity. He knows that this custom, this religious custom, is alive and strong within the people, and so what better opportunity to engage them about this new truth, about what God has done in salvation, than on Sabbath. And again and again and again, that is the pattern of Paul. And we see that the Jews all over Asia, in every different city, are upholding the Sabbath command. Beyond this, we don't see many commandments about the Sabbath in the New Testament. And I think that's interesting, especially considering all the different congregations that we have that are so made up of Gentiles. You think what a challenge this would be if the new Christians were to keep the Sabbath, what a lifestyle change that would be. But we don't see the New Testament calling people to account to keep the Sabbath. In fact, in Colossians chapter 2, we're told not to judge those who want to keep a holy day or who want to keep a Sabbath and those who don't. It is left up to the onus of the individual to decide whether or not to do that. But it is not a command given by the church. One of the passages I find most interesting about the Sabbath in the New Testament comes from Hebrews chapter 4. And the Hebrews writer is wrestling, of course, with this idea that there was always meant to be something more than the Jewish revelation, than the law and the covenant that was given through Moses. And so, he recognizes that the people have never really been at rest. They were told that when they entered the promised land, they would enter God's rest. But they always had one problem or another. There was always something going on that was disturbing that rest. And so he points out that there is a rest. There is a Sabbath rest for God's people, but it's found in Jesus Christ. And in the salvation that we have from him, in the work that he did for us to save us so that we don't have to work anymore. This is the true Sabbath rest. That we are sanctified, that we are made holy, but not by our work, but by resting on the work of Christ. Well, a few thoughts and application then. That this is such an important passage for the people of Israel. Something that was to be one of their distinctive marks, something that was to proclaim possibly the fundamental truth that they were a people set apart from God, calls forward, I think, into our lives. The first thing I'll say is that we should reflect the reality of a people who are holy to God, who are set apart. I don't think we're called to do that in a keeping of a Sabbath day. That was how God chose to do it in the Old Covenant. But I think we are called to resoundingly speak that truth, That we are a people who have been pulled out of this world and who are dedicated, who are holy, who are sanctified by our God. We are called to be holy to God just as the nation of Israel was. Somehow this needs to become visible in our lives. And hopefully it will become so visible that it will cause those around us, it will cause those near us to ask questions about it, to see the reality of it, the sincerity of it. It should be a stamp upon who we are, something that makes us distinctive in the world, that we are set apart to our God. And so somehow we need to place conscious markers in our life that show truly, I am God's person. I live for Him. The decisions that I make, the way that I spend my time, the way that I treat others should speak loudly to those around me in my life that I am first and foremost and primarily God's person. Not my own person, not the world's person, God's person. So somehow we need to work that reality into our lives. Well, secondly, I think this passage speaks that we should reflect the reality of a God who created the world. We live in a world that denies this fact again and again and again and again. But this is the truth, that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. We know God as creator, just as Israel did. A timeless truth that our world needs to know as it begins to strive to understand who God is. And so our lives should affirm that the world is what God has brought into creation. To live in such a way that honors God as creator and the creation is His. What a big question for us to unpack. What it means to live in full view of the reality that God is the creator. That the whole world is His. That He has the power to speak things into existence. The power to do all that. The world should know in the way that we live our lives that we believe that God is able to do great things like creating the world, and God has done them. Well, a third and final point of application. We should value and defend opportunities to be still with God. I'm not saying to you that you have to set apart one day a week or that it has to be the seventh day. But we need to find time in our lives to be alone with God, to dwell on our relationship with Him. We only need to stop and to consider the value of the time that we spend reorienting our hearts away from a world that tries to capture them and towards a God who has sanctified us, to understand how important this is. To be devoted and faithful to God, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges of the Christian life. The fact that we are in this world, but we're not really of this world. This is a challenging thing. It's challenging not only in concept, but in practical doing of it. It's hard to give myself fully to God and to say no when the world pulls me away. That's a hard thing. And I know that I will never be able to do the good thing that I'll be able to do in unfolding that as fully as possible in my life. I'll never be able to have it be so plain and evident and sincere before my neighbors. I'll never be able to glorify God in those times and then be able to glorify God better outside of those times if I do not carve out a space in my life for it, if I do not defend it, if I do not set barriers around it. And we don't need, certainly, we should never fall into the trap in which the religious leaders in the life of Christ came to, where they placed it above all the other commands of God and wouldn't even allow good things to happen on that time, things that glorified God. But I think it is so essential to the life of a Christian that we make these opportunities to be still with God and to consider what it means to be a people who are holy to Him. And so my encouragement then is to set a time in your week to dwell with God, to be with Him, to consider your relationship to Him, and to devote yourself to Him anew. When we reflect on the experiences that move us and change us, I know at least for me, these are foremost among them, and they are a blessing to us when we devote ourselves to them. Well, I think of a passage early in the part of the Gospel of Mark. And maybe I'll read that verse in Mark chapter 1. And it's merely an example of what, as we read the Gospels, we see is so common. But in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, we read, "Early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place, and he was praying there. And then his disciples come to him, and Jesus goes off and begins a day of ministry." But I think this is so often the case in the life of Jesus. He's sneaking away for time alone to pray, to time to be with God. And if there was ever a person who had the demands of public life and who would make every excuse for how busy it is, it might be Jesus. But he defends this time with God. Jesus' prayer life stands as such a great example to me in how I should observe the Sabbath ideal in my own life, of how I should make sure that there's always time for time with God. I think it's crucial for us to work to devote our hearts and our minds to God. And it's not that we do this so that we'll be acceptable to God or so that we can attain salvation, but we do it because the reality of God's rest is all about us. We have been saved, we have been sanctified, we have been made holy, and God is calling to our hearts to consider that truth in the way that we live. We can honor our Savior, we can honor our God, we can be a blessing to each other in the church and to the world around us when we take time in our lives to choose Him first and above all else, and to honor the Sabbath in our lives by being alone with God.